There is something strange about the walls around us, something we rarely stop to notice. The bedroom door that closes, the bathroom with its lock, the curtains drawn against the evening street. All of these things feel natural, obvious even, as though humans have always lived this way. But they have not. For most of human history, for thousands upon thousands of years, people lived without privacy in ways that would feel impossible to us now. They slept in rooms with 10 or 15 others. They bathed in front of neighbors. They relieved themselves in spaces anyone could wander past. Privacy, as we understand it, the idea that you could be alone, that you could have thoughts and actions no one else witnessed, was not something most people expected or even wanted. This is not a story about what was lost or about what we gained. It is simply a story about how people lived day after day, year after year, in a world where being alone was rare and being watched was normal. It is about the textures of that life, the small details we have forgotten, and the slow, almost invisible way things changed. There is no single moment when privacy arrived, no grand invention or declaration. Instead, over centuries, walls thickened, rooms multiplied, doors appeared, and the idea that you could close yourself away from others became something people began to want, and then to expect, and then to demand. But before all of that, there was a different world. A world where your body was not entirely your own, where your sleep was shared, where the most intimate moments of existence happened in the presence of others who thought nothing of it. This is where we begin, in the oldest human dwellings, in the firelight and the dark, where families and strangers pressed together against the cold, and where the very concept of being alone would have seemed more frightening than comforting. Let us go back, not dramatically, but slowly, the way memory works, the way history actually unfolds, in small repetitions and barely noticed shifts. Let us go back to a time when walls were thin, or not there at all, and see how people managed, how they lived, what they thought about, and how, without ever intending to, they began the long, quiet journey toward the closed bedroom door and the locked bathroom and the life we know now, where we can be alone whenever we wish, and where that aloneness feels like a right, something owed to us, something we cannot imagine living without. The journey begins in the cold. In the earliest human settlements, the ones we can piece together from fragments and foundations, from post holes and ash layers, and the faint discolorations in ancient soil, there was almost always one central element that organized life. Fire. Not fire as we think of it now, contained and decorative, but fire as survival, as the difference between sleep and freezing, between cooked food and sickness, between darkness and the ability to see faces. Around this fire, in structures made of wood and hide and stone and mud, people gathered not just to eat or warm themselves, but to exist. The space around the fire was the space of living, and it was shared by everyone in the household, which might be a family or might include others, relatives, laborers, people whose relationship to the core family we can only guess at. These structures, we should understand, were not large. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, tells us that many early permanent dwellings were single-room affairs, often round or oval, sometimes rectangular, with a floor area that might be anywhere from 15 to 40 square meters. In this space, which would be smaller than many modern bedrooms, a group of people, perhaps 6 or 8 or 10, would conduct all the activities of life. They would prepare food here, eat here, work on tools or clothing here, tell stories here, argue here, comfort children here, give birth here, tend to illness here, and, when darkness came, sleep here, all together, in the warmth of the fire and the warmth of each other's bodies. There were no separate rooms. The idea of a separate room, a space with a door that closed, a space designated for one activity or one person, did not exist for these people. The dwelling was the room, singular, and whatever happened in that dwelling happened in the presence of everyone else who lived there. If you were tired, you lay down near the fire or against the wall, on whatever bedding was available, furs or woven mats or piled grasses. If someone else was already asleep nearby, you lay down next to them. If you woke in the night, you would see and hear the others, the sound of breathing, the movement of bodies adjusting in sleep, the occasional cry of a child, the murmur of someone who could not sleep, the presence of people always there, always close. This was not considered strange or intrusive. It was simply how life worked. The concept of privacy, the notion that you might want to sleep in a room alone or with only one other person, was not part of the mental landscape of these early communities. Being alone, in fact, would have been dangerous, a sign that something was wrong. Alone, you were vulnerable to cold, to predators that might wander close to human settlements, to injury or illness with no one to notice or help. Alone was unsafe. Together was normal. Together was warm. Together was how humans had always been, back into the depths of time before permanent settlements, when groups moved across landscapes and slept in temporary shelters or in the open, huddled close, watching each other, keeping each other alive through proximity and shared vigilance. In these single-room dwellings, the rhythm of life was shaped by light and dark, by the seasons, by the work that needed doing. During the day, when weather permitted, much of life might happen outside, in the doorway or in the space around the dwelling. But when cold or rain or darkness drove people inside, they came together in that one room, and the boundaries between people softened in ways we would find difficult now. A woman nursing an infant would do so wherever she happened to be, in full view of everyone. A man repairing a tool or weaving a basket would work in the same space where children played or argued. Conversations would overlap, private words spoken in tones that others could hear but might politely ignore, a kind of social deafness that allowed for some small measure of psychological privacy even when physical privacy was impossible. There is evidence, from various sites and time periods, that some dwellings had small alcoves or partitioned areas, sometimes created with hanging furs or woven screens. But these divisions were not solid, not permanent, not private in the sense we would recognize. They created shadow, perhaps, or a slight visual barrier, but sound still carried, bodies were still close, and the fundamental shared nature of the space remained. A couple seeking to be intimate, for instance, would not have had a separate bedroom to retreat to. Instead, they would wait for others to sleep, or perhaps move to a far corner of the dwelling. But the act itself would happen in a space where others were present, where sounds could be heard, where the polite fiction was that no one was paying attention, that sleep or distraction provided a kind of courtesy privacy. When someone fell ill in a medieval household, there was no hospital to go to, no private recovery room. The sick person remained where they were, in the shared space of the home, and their illness became a shared experience for everyone who lived there. They would lie on their usual sleeping place, or perhaps be moved closer to the fire, and the household would continue around them, with modifications, adjustments to accommodate the illness, but no fundamental separation. Children would see their parents or siblings weakened by fever, would hear them moan or cry out, would witness the body struggle with disease in immediate, undeniable terms. They would see the sweat, the vomit, the blood, the waste products of an ill body, because these things could not be hidden away. They would smell the illness, the sweet sick smell of infection or the sharp smell of fever sweat. They would be there when remedies were applied, when leeches were attached, when poultices were placed on swollen areas, when prayers were said over the suffering person. This proximity to illness must have been frightening for children, but it was also educational in a way. They learned what different illnesses looked like, how bodies responded, what could be done to help or comfort. They learned that illness was a part of life, that bodies were fragile, that sometimes people got better and sometimes they did not. And all of this learning happened through direct witness, through being there, because there was nowhere else to be. Children, growing up in these environments, learned from the beginning that life was communal, that the bodies and actions of others were simply part of the landscape of existence. They saw birth, they saw death, they saw the full range of human bodily functions and emotional states, not because these things were shown to them deliberately, but because there was nowhere else for these things to happen. A woman giving birth might labor in the same room where children slept, where the fire burned, where life continued around her. The sounds, the mess, the intensity of it were not hidden away. They were part of the ordinary texture of existence, witnessed and accepted, and then woven into the fabric of memory and understanding. This, we should pause to consider, was not a brief phase in human history. This way of living, in shared, single-room spaces, continued for thousands of years. It continued in varying forms across different cultures and climates and social structures. It was the baseline, the default setting of human domestic life. The Roman poor lived this way, in crowded insulae, apartment buildings where families occupied single rooms and shared common spaces with dozens of others. Medieval peasants lived this way, in cottages where parents and children and sometimes animals all occupied the same space, where the heat of the animals was part of the warmth that got everyone through winter, where the smell and sound and presence of livestock was simply part of home. In many parts of Asia, in Africa, in the Americas before European contact, similar patterns emerged: the single-room dwelling, the shared sleeping space, the communal nature of daily life. And people adapted. They developed social codes, unspoken rules about what you acknowledged and what you pretended not to notice. They learned to create psychological privacy through collective agreement to ignore certain things, to turn away at certain moments, to give each other the gift of pretended aloneness even when everyone was together. These adaptations were necessary, but they were also effective. Communities functioned, families bonded, children grew up healthy and capable, all without the physical privacy we now consider essential to human dignity and mental health. There was, in these arrangements, a kind of intimacy that is hard for us to imagine now, but which must have been powerful. You knew the people you lived with in the most complete way possible. You knew the sounds they made in sleep, the way they moved when they were troubled, the small habits and rhythms of their bodies. You knew when someone was ill before they said anything, because you heard their breathing change. You knew when relationships were strained because you felt the tension in the shared space. You knew the full humanity of the people around you, because there was no way to hide it, no door to close, no separate room to retreat to when you wanted to be less than fully visible. This knowledge, this enforced intimacy, shaped relationships in ways we can only partly reconstruct. It must have created strong bonds, but also tensions that had nowhere to go, no release valve of temporary separation. Arguments would have been witnessed by everyone. Reconciliations, too. The entire emotional weather of the household was a shared experience, something everyone participated in whether they wanted to or not. Privacy, in the emotional sense, was perhaps as impossible as physical privacy. Your feelings were known because your behavior was visible, and in a small space with few diversions. People paid attention, noticed, remembered. Yet people endured, and more than endured, they built lives, raised families, created cultures and traditions and systems of meaning that sustained them. The lack of privacy, which seems to us like it would be intolerable, was simply the condition of life, accepted the way we accept the need to eat or sleep. It was not a problem to solve because no one imagined it could be otherwise. The resources required to give everyone their own space, their own room, were simply not available. Building materials were precious, labor-intensive. Heat was expensive, difficult to maintain in multiple rooms. The technology of doors and locks and windows with glass existed, but was reserved for the wealthy, for those who could afford to divide space, to create barriers, to live in ways the common people could not. So the common people, the vast majority of humanity for most of history, lived together in spaces that forced constant awareness of each other, and they made it work. They found ways to coexist, to grant each other small dignities, to maintain some sense of self even when the self was always on display. They learned to live without privacy because they had to, because that was how the world was arranged, and because no one had yet convinced them that it could, or should, be any different. But things were different, or beginning to be, in certain places, among certain people. And those differences, small at first, barely noticeable, would eventually spread, slowly, like water finding new channels, until the world of the shared room, the communal sleep, the witnessed life, would start to seem strange, then primitive, then intolerable, and finally, to most people in the modern world, almost unimaginable. This change did not happen quickly. It did not happen everywhere at once. It happened in layers, in centuries-long shifts, in the accumulation of small advantages and new ideas and changing expectations. To understand it, we need to look not just at how people lived in those early shared spaces, but at what they did every day, how they managed the most basic aspects of existence, the aspects we now consider most private, most personal, and see how those two were different, were communal, were witnessed and shared in ways that would make us deeply uncomfortable now. Consider bathing, for instance, or what passed for bathing in times and places where water was not abundant, where heating water was labor-intensive, where the very concept of cleanliness was different from our current understanding, shaped more by necessity and available resources than by abstract ideas about hygiene or privacy. In many ancient and medieval communities, people did not bathe frequently, not in the way we think of bathing, full-body immersion in hot water done regularly and in private. Water was heavy to carry, fuel was needed to heat it, and the time required to prepare and take a bath was time not spent on other necessary labor. So bathing, when it happened, was often a communal activity, something done in groups, in public bathhouses or in rivers or lakes, in full view of others, where nakedness was accepted, expected, unremarkable. The Romans, of course, are famous for their public baths, the great thermae that were central to Roman social life. But we should be careful not to romanticize these too much, or to think of them as we might think of a modern spa, a place of luxury and privacy. The Roman baths were public in the fullest sense, enormous structures where hundreds or thousands of people might gather on any given day, where you would undress in a common changing area, where you would move through different rooms, the caldarium, the tepidarium, the frigidarium, hot and warm and cold, in the company of strangers and acquaintances, where your body was visible, where the bodies of others, young and old, fit and infirm, were visible to you, where this visibility was simply part of the experience, unremarkable, normal. Men and women bathed separately, usually, though not always, and there were social codes about behavior, about what was acceptable, but the fundamental fact remained that bathing was a shared, witnessed activity. You were naked with others. You sat in pools with others. You were scraped clean by attendants using strigils, metal scrapers that removed oil and sweat and dirt from your skin, and this was done in rooms where others were being similarly attended to, where the sounds and sights of cleansing were all around you. Privacy was not part of the equation. The bath was about cleanliness, yes, but also about socializing, about business dealings, about seeing and being seen, about participating in the life of the community in a space where social distinctions were temporarily softened by the shared nakedness, though never entirely erased, because even in the baths, the wealthy had better accommodations, warmer rooms, more attentive slaves. For the poor, for those who could not afford the entry fee to the great thermae, or who lived in places where such structures did not exist, bathing was even more basic, more exposed. A river or stream, if one was nearby, served as the bathing place. Women might wash clothes and themselves in the same water, in the company of other women, all engaged in the same task, their bodies visible to each other, their conversations mixing with the sounds of water and the work of scrubbing fabric against stones. Men might bathe in a different section of the river, or at a different time, but the principle was the same, the communal nature of cleansing, the acceptance that this was a shared activity, not a private one. In medieval Europe, as Roman infrastructure crumbled and was not replaced, public bathhouses continued to exist, though they became more sporadic, more varied in quality. Some were well-maintained, legitimate businesses where people went for cleanliness and relief from the aches of labor. Others became associated with prostitution, with disease, with moral looseness, and eventually many were closed by authorities worried about sin or plague or social disorder. But before these closures, and in places where bathhouses remained respectable, the pattern continued, the communal undressing, the shared hot water, the nakedness accepted as necessary and unremarkable. In homes, when bathing happened at all, it was usually a very public affair as well. A wooden tub might be brought into the main room of the house, the only room heated, and filled with water that had been laboriously heated over the fire. One person would bathe, often the head of the household, and then others might use the same water, one after another, the water growing cooler and dirtier with each successive bather. This would all happen in front of whoever else was in the room, because again, there was nowhere else for it to happen. The tub was heavy and awkward to move, the water was precious, the warmth was needed, so it stayed where it was, in the central space, and people worked around it, glancing over perhaps, or ignoring it, or commenting on something, but in any case, witnessing it, being present for it. Children, watching their parents and siblings bathe, would learn that bodies were just bodies, that nakedness in the context of washing was not shameful or hidden. They would take their turn in the tub when they were told to, climbing into water already used, and this too was normal, unremarkable. The idea that bathing should be a private act, done behind a closed door in a dedicated room, was not something that occurred to these people, because the resources to create such privacy did not exist, and the cultural expectation that such privacy was desirable had not yet formed. Even among the wealthy, in great houses with multiple rooms and more resources, bathing was often still a semi-public affair. A noble might have servants present to help with bathing, to pour water, to attend to details, and these servants would see their employer naked, would handle their body in the process of cleansing, and this was simply part of their role, accepted, expected. The noble might even conduct business or receive visitors while bathing. In Roman times certainly, but also later, the tub serving as a kind of throne from which to hold court, the nakedness not seen as an impediment to dignity, though over time, this would change as ideas about modesty and the exposure of the body shifted. But for most people, for most of history, bathing remained something that happened in view of others, or at least in the general presence of others, in ways that did not allow for complete privacy. And this pattern extended to other bodily functions as well, to the acts we now consider most private, most in need of concealment. Consider the need to relieve oneself, to urinate or defecate, functions that every human must perform multiple times a day, and which we now manage in elaborate privacy, in rooms specifically designed for this purpose, with doors that lock, with conventions so strong that even talking about these functions directly is considered crude in many social contexts. Children, watching their parents and siblings bathe, would learn that bodies were just bodies, that nakedness in the context of washing was not shameful or hidden. They would take their turn in the tub when they were told to, climbing into water already used, and this too was normal, unremarkable. The idea that bathing should be a private act, done behind a closed door in a dedicated room, was not something that occurred to these people, because the resources to create such privacy did not exist, and the cultural expectation that such privacy was desirable had not yet formed. Even among the wealthy, in great houses with multiple rooms and more resources, bathing was often still a semi-public affair. A noble might have servants present to help with bathing, to pour water, to attend to details, and these servants would see their employer naked, would handle their body in the process of cleansing, and this was simply part of their role, accepted, expected. The noble might even conduct business or receive visitors while bathing. In Roman times certainly, but also later, the tub serving as a kind of throne from which to hold court, the nakedness not seen as an impediment to dignity, though over time, this would change as ideas about modesty and the exposure of the body shifted. But for most people, for most of history, bathing remained something that happened in view of others, or at least in the general presence of others, in ways that did not allow for complete privacy. And this pattern extended to other bodily functions as well, to the acts we now consider most private, most in need of concealment. Consider the need to relieve oneself, to urinate or defecate, functions that every human must perform multiple times a day, and which we now manage in elaborate privacy, in rooms specifically designed for this purpose, with doors that lock, with conventions so strong that even talking about these functions directly is considered crude in many social contexts. This elaborate privacy, this nearly absolute concealment, is very new. For most of human history, waste elimination was a much more visible, much more communal affair. In ancient cities, public latrines were common, and they were truly public. In Rome, for instance, latrines were often long benches with holes cut in them, positioned over channels of running water that would carry waste away. But there were no dividers between the holes, no walls, no doors. You would sit next to other people, sometimes dozens of them, all engaged in the same activity, and you would conduct your business in full view of others, and they in view of you. Conversations would continue. Business might be discussed, and when you were finished, you would use a communal sponge on a stick, soaked in vinegar or salt water, to clean yourself, and this sponge would then be returned to its bucket for the next person. We find this horrifying now, the lack of barriers, the shared cleaning implement, the absolute absence of privacy. But to the Romans, this was efficient, practical, even social. The latrine was a place where you might run into acquaintances, where you could chat while attending to a basic need. The nakedness below the waist was just a fact, no more embarrassing than having someone see your face. The vulnerability of the act, which we feel so strongly, was not something they seemed to register in the same way. Or perhaps they did feel it, but accepted it, because there was no alternative, because privacy was not offered, and you either used the public latrine or you found some other, often less hygienic, solution. In medieval villages, the situation was different, but no more private. Most peasant cottages did not have indoor plumbing or dedicated toilets of any kind. Waste might be eliminated in a designated area outside, a pit or a spot behind the house, but this area was not hidden, not enclosed. Others could see you heading there, could potentially see you squatting or standing, especially in daylight. At night, chamber pots were used, simple vessels kept in the main room of the house, and these would be emptied in the morning, sometimes out a window into the street, sometimes into a cesspit, but in any case, the use of the chamber pot was not private. If you needed to urinate in the night, you would get up from your sleeping place, find the chamber pot in the dark, use it, and return to bed, and if others were awake, they would know what you were doing, would hear it, might smell it, and all of this was simply part of living in close quarters. In castles and manor houses, there were garderobes, small rooms built into the thickness of walls, with stone seats and openings that dropped waist-down shafts into moats or pits below. These offered more privacy than a chamber pot in a shared bedroom, but they were often cold, dark, uncomfortable places, and even here, privacy was limited. Multiple garderobes might open onto the same shaft, servants might come and go in nearby corridors, and the sounds and smells of use were not particularly well contained. Children, again, grew up seeing and experiencing all of this as normal. They would be trained to use designated waste areas, but this training would happen in full view of the family, with no particular emphasis on privacy or shame. Accidents were cleaned up without much fuss. The bodily functions that produced waste were understood as necessary, natural, not particularly noteworthy beyond the practical concern of hygiene and sanitation, which itself was understood imperfectly and managed with whatever means were available. As cities grew larger, as populations became denser, the problem of waste became more acute, but solutions remained largely public and visible. Night soil collectors would come through streets, removing waste from cesspits and chamber pots, and everyone knew what they were doing, could smell them working, could see the carts filled with human excrement being hauled away to be used as fertilizer on fields outside the city. The waste of the body, which we now hide so carefully, was in medieval and early modern cities a visible part of life, something you encountered, smelled, walked around, accepted. There was no elaborate infrastructure to hide it, no underground sewers in most places, no private bathrooms, no flush toilets. Those technologies would come, but slowly, and first only for the wealthy, and then gradually spreading downward through society as expectations changed, as the idea that human waste should be concealed, that bodily functions should be private, became more widespread. But that change was still centuries away for most people. In the meantime, in the long meanwhile that constituted most of human history, people simply managed. They developed noses that could tolerate smells we would find unbearable. They developed a kind of social blindness to the elimination functions of others, a courtesy that said, "I will not stare, I will not comment, I will pretend not to notice, even though I clearly can." They learned to live with a degree of physical exposure that we would consider degrading, and they did not consider it so because they had no comparison, no alternative model of how things could be. And this acceptance, this accommodation to a lack of privacy in the most intimate aspects of existence, extended into other areas as well, into the realm of the body's other needs and functions, into sickness and injury, into sex and reproduction, into death. When someone fell ill in a medieval household, there was no hospital to go to, no private recovery room. The sick person remained where they were, in the shared space of the home, and their illness became a shared experience for everyone who lived there. They would lie on their usual sleeping place, or perhaps be moved closer to the fire, and the household would continue around them, with modifications, adjustments to accommodate the illness, but no fundamental separation. Children would see their parents or siblings weakened by fever, would hear them moan or cry out, would witness the body struggle with disease in immediate, undeniable terms. They would see the sweat, the vomit, the blood, the waste products of an ill body, because these things could not be hidden away. They would smell the illness, the sweet sick smell of infection or the sharp smell of fever sweat. They would be there when remedies were applied, when leeches were attached, when poultices were placed on swollen areas, when prayers were said over the suffering person. This proximity to illness must have been frightening for children, but it was also educational in a way. They learned what different illnesses looked like, how bodies responded, what could be done to help or comfort. They learned that illness was a part of life, that bodies were fragile, that sometimes people got better and sometimes they did not. And all of this learning happened through direct witness, through being there, because there was nowhere else to be. Adults, caring for the sick, did so without privacy as well. A mother tending to a feverish child would do so in full view of the rest of the family, her worry visible, her exhaustion obvious. A husband caring for a sick wife would help her with intimate tasks, cleaning her, helping her use a chamber pot, and others in the household might assist, or might simply be present, and all of this was simply what you did when someone was ill. The idea that caregiving should be private, that the indignities of illness should be concealed from all but a professional medical staff or the closest family members, was not part of the framework of understanding. And when someone died, which happened with much greater frequency than it does now, especially among children and the elderly, that too happened in the shared space. People died at home, in the main room, surrounded by family and often by neighbors who would come to sit with the dying person, to pray, to say goodbye. The moment of death was witnessed, the final breath heard, the body's transition from alive to not alive seen and marked by those present. After death, the body would be prepared for burial by family members, usually women, who would wash it, dress it, lay it out in the main room for viewing. For a day or two, the body would lie there while people came to pay respects, and life would continue around it, in a strange coexistence of the dead and the living, of grief and routine, all happening in the same small space. Children would see all of this, would touch the dead body if encouraged to, would understand death as a physical reality, not an abstraction. They would learn the rituals of death, the washing and dressing, the prayers and lamentations, through participation and observation, in a space that did not allow them to look away, that made death part of the texture of life. This intimacy with death, this inability to separate the living from the process of dying and the presence of the dead, shaped attitudes toward mortality, toward the body, toward the boundary between life and whatever came after. Death was not hidden in hospitals, not managed by strangers, not concealed from children and the sensitive. Death was known, familiar, expected, and while it was mourned and feared, it was also integrated into the ordinary flow of existence in ways that our current practices of dying in hospitals, of bodies handled by professionals, of children protected from the sight of death, have made foreign to us. The same pattern, this same lack of privacy, this same communal witness, extended into the realm of sex and childbirth. We have touched on this already. The idea that couples in single-room dwellings had to find ways to be intimate while others were present, but it bears expanding on, because the implications are significant for how we understand both the history of privacy and the history of human sexuality and reproduction. In a one-room house, where parents and children all slept in the same space, sexual intercourse happened, but it happened within constraints. Couples likely waited for darkness, for the polite fiction of sleep from the others in the room, for a moment of relative quiet. They likely moved carefully, quietly, trying to maintain some degree of discretion, but they could not achieve anything like complete privacy. Sounds carried in the dark. Movement could be felt if someone was close enough. And over time, as children grew old enough to understand what was happening, they would come to know that this was something their parents did, something married adults did, and it was not discussed directly, but it was known, part of the unspoken knowledge of living in close quarters. This does not mean children were exposed to explicit sexual behavior in the way we might fear now. Social codes existed, unwritten rules about timing and discretion, about what was done when and how, rules that protected some measure of dignity for all involved. But it does mean that sex was not the deeply private, hidden activity that modern culture has made it. It was something that happened in the shared space of the home, managed through timing and social courtesy, but not through the kind of architectural privacy we now consider essential. For unmarried young people, for adolescents experiencing the stirrings of sexuality, the lack of privacy must have been even more complicated. Masturbation, a normal part of human sexual development, would have to be managed in secret in whatever moments of aloneness could be found, which were few. The discovery of one's own sexuality, which we now think of as a deeply private process, was something that had to happen in the cracks and margins of communal life, in the woods perhaps, or in the dark before others woke, or in whatever brief solitude could be found. Courtship too happened in public, in the presence of others, with chaperones or family members nearby, especially for young women of any social standing. The idea of a couple being alone together before marriage was scandalous in many societies, something to be prevented because of the assumption that privacy would lead to sexual activity. And this assumption was probably correct, in the sense that humans have always sought physical intimacy, but the prevention of privacy was a way of controlling that intimacy, of ensuring that it happened only within sanctioned relationships, only after marriage. But even after marriage, privacy remained limited. And when pregnancy resulted, as it often did, the experience of pregnancy and childbirth was, like illness and death, something witnessed and shared by the community. Childbirth, in particular, was a communal event. When a woman went into labor, other women would be summoned, neighbors, relatives, experienced midwives, and they would gather in the home, usually in that same single room where the family lived. The laboring woman would be surrounded by these attendants, who would offer advice, encouragement, practical help. They would hold her arms, support her back, help her into different positions, catch the baby when it came. The sounds of labor, the cries and moans, the encouragement from the midwife and other women, the intensity of the physical work of birth, All of this would fill the room, and while men were often excluded from the immediate birth scene, sent outside or to another part of the house if there was one, children and other women were not. Young girls would see their mothers or sisters or neighbors give birth, would learn what labor looked like, how long it could take, what kind of pain was involved, how the baby emerged, what needed to be done immediately after birth to ensure the survival of both mother and child. This was education through observation, the passing down of knowledge about childbirth from one generation of women to the next, but it was also an ordeal that was shared, witnessed, made communal rather than private. The vulnerability of the laboring woman, the exposure of her body, the intensity of her pain and effort, all of this was seen by others and accepted, supported, normalized. After birth, the mother would remain in the main room, recovering, nursing the new infant, and this too was visible to all. Breastfeeding happened frequently, whenever the infant needed to nurse, and while women might drape a cloth over their shoulder for modesty, the act itself was not hidden away in a separate room. It happened in the course of daily life, while other activities continued around it, and children grew up seeing their mothers and other women nurse infants, understanding this as a normal part of existence, not something to be concealed or made private. The infant's care, the changing of cloths used as diapers, the soothing of crying, the constant physical attention required by a new baby, all of this happened in the shared space, and everyone in the household participated or was at least aware of it. Privacy in the care of infants was not possible, not expected, and somehow people managed. Infants thrived or did not, and life continued. What we see when we look at all of these aspects of life, bathing, waste elimination, illness, death, sex, childbirth, nursing, is a consistent pattern, a world in which the most intimate, most vulnerable, most physically exposed aspects of human existence were conducted in the presence of others, witnessed, known, accepted. Privacy, as a condition that could be reliably achieved, that could be expected or demanded, simply did not exist for most people in most places for most of history. But it would be wrong to say that people therefore had no sense of privacy, no desire for it, no ways of creating it psychologically even when it could not be created physically. There were still secrets, still things people tried to hide, still a sense of self that was separate from the public self, from the self that others could see. People learned to create privacy in their minds, even when their bodies were always visible. They learned to maintain inner lives, thoughts and feelings and desires that were not shared, that were kept separate from the communal experience of daily life. They learned to daydream, to retreat inward while their bodies remained present in the shared space, to cultivate a kind of mental distance that allowed for some preservation of individual identity. This psychological privacy was perhaps more important in a world without physical privacy, more necessary as a way of maintaining sanity, of not being completely overwhelmed by the constant presence of others. People learned to be alone in their heads, even when they were never alone in their bodies, and this skill, this ability to create internal space, must have been developed in ways we have lost now that we can achieve physical solitude so easily, now that we can close a door and be truly alone. There were also moments, brief and precious, when physical solitude could be achieved. A walk in the woods, a trip to fetch water from a distant well, a moment in the fields during harvest. These small windows of time when you might be out of sight of others, when you could breathe differently, move differently, think differently without the awareness of being watched. People must have treasured these moments, must have used them for rest, for reflection, for the private acts that could not be managed in the shared home. But these moments were the exception, not the rule, and they were always temporary, always shadowed by the need to return, to rejoin the group, to resume the visible, communal life. You could not live in solitude, could not choose to be alone for extended periods without becoming an outsider, a hermit, someone who had left the bounds of normal society and who was therefore viewed with suspicion or pity or fear. The pressure to be visible, to be part of the group, to participate in communal life was intense, not necessarily because of explicit rules, but because of the structure of existence. You needed the group for survival, for labor, for protection, for companionship, for the basic necessities of life. Choosing solitude, choosing to live apart, meant giving up these securities, and very few people were willing or able to do that. So people stayed together, in their shared rooms, in their communal villages, in their dense cities, and they made accommodations, developed strategies for coexistence, created social norms that allowed for some balance between the needs of the individual and the reality of the group. They learned when to speak and when to be silent, when to look and when to look away, when to acknowledge what they had witnessed and when to pretend they had not. These norms, these unwritten social codes, were crucial to making communal life bearable. Without them, the constant proximity, the constant visibility, the constant awareness of others and their awareness of you would have been intolerable. But with them, with the shared understanding that certain courtesies would be observed, that certain things would not be mentioned even when they were known, that certain moments would be granted a kind of psychological privacy even when physical privacy was impossible, life could proceed, relationships could be maintained, communities could function. And communities did function for thousands of years with this model of life, this pattern of shared space and communal witness. Villages grew, cities expanded, civilizations rose and fell, and through all of it, for the vast majority of people, the basic condition of domestic life remained the same: the one-room dwelling, the shared sleep, the witnessed existence. But there were always exceptions, always edges to this pattern, always places where something different was beginning to emerge, among the wealthy, among those who had resources beyond the basic necessities of survival. There had always been some degree of physical privacy, some ability to create separate spaces, to divide the household into rooms with different functions, to have servants who could be sent away, doors that could be closed. This was not privacy as we understand it now, not complete or guaranteed, but it was more than what the common people had, and it allowed for different ways of living, different expectations about personal space and solitude. In Roman villas, for instance, the houses of the wealthy were divided into many rooms, each with a specific purpose. There were public rooms where guests were received, where business was conducted, where the master of the house displayed his wealth and status. And there were private rooms, inner chambers where the family lived, where the master and his wife might sleep, where children might have their own spaces, at least as they grew older. These divisions created zones of relative privacy, places where the family could be separate from servants and guests, where intimate activities could be conducted with less witness. But even here, privacy was limited. Servants moved through all parts of the house, attending to the needs of the family, and their presence meant that even in the private rooms, there was always someone else there, someone seeing, someone knowing. The wealthy had more privacy than the poor, but they did not have what we would call complete privacy, the ability to be truly alone in one's own home, with no one else present or able to enter without permission. In medieval castles, a similar pattern emerged. The Great Hall was the public center of the castle, where meals were served, where the lord held court, where retainers and servants and guests all gathered. But there were also private chambers, the solar being one example, a room where the lord and lady might retreat for some degree of separation from the bustle of the hall. These chambers were still not private in the modern sense. Servants still came and went, children and close attendants were still present, but they offered more separation than the Great Hall, more ability to control who was present and what was witnessed. And within these private chambers, we start to see the emergence of furniture and architecture that allowed for even more privacy. The bed, for instance, began to evolve from a simple raised platform into an elaborate structure, often with curtains that could be drawn around it, creating a kind of room within a room, a space that could be closed off from view even if servants were in the chamber. These curtain beds appear in illustrations and descriptions from the medieval and early modern periods, and they seem to have served multiple purposes. Warmth certainly, keeping the cold drafts of stone castles at bay, but also privacy, creating a barrier between the sleepers and anyone else who might be in the room. A couple could close the curtains and have a degree of intimacy that was not possible in the open sleeping arrangements of the poor. They could speak privately, could be physically close without being watched, could conduct their married life with some separation from the servants and children who might be sleeping elsewhere in the chamber or in adjacent spaces. This was not perfect privacy. Curtains could be heard through, they could be opened without warning, but it was a significant step toward the idea that sleep and the activities associated with the marriage bed should be separated from the general witness of the household. Similarly, in wealthy homes, there began to be more specialization of space, more rooms designated for specific functions. A room for dining, separate from a room for sleeping. A room for receiving guests, separate from a room for family use. And eventually, as architecture evolved, as building techniques improved, as wealth increased, these specialized rooms would multiply, creating houses with many rooms, each offering a different degree and kind of privacy. But this was a slow process, and it was limited to a very small percentage of the population. For every nobleman with a castle full of separate chambers, there were thousands of peasants living in single-room cottages. For every merchant with a townhouse divided into multiple rooms, there were countless laborers living in crowded tenements. The experiences of the wealthy, the privacy they could achieve, were not representative of how most people lived, and we should be careful not to generalize from the houses of the rich to the experience of the general population. Still, the choices made by the wealthy, the architectural forms they developed, the expectations about privacy they cultivated, would eventually influence the broader culture. What the wealthy did was visible, was emulated by those just below them on the social ladder, and over time, as wealth spread, as the middle class emerged and grew, the multi-room house, the specialized spaces, the idea that privacy was desirable and achievable would trickle down through society. But that process would take centuries. In the medieval period, even into the early modern period, most people still lived without physical privacy in the ways we have been describing. The changes happening among the wealthy were interesting, significant in retrospect, but they were not yet touching the daily lives of the majority. And even among the wealthy, privacy as we understand it now, complete separation from others, guaranteed solitude, was still not available in many contexts. Because even the wealthy were rarely alone. They were attended by servants, always, and those servants were present for everything, dressing, bathing, sleeping, waking. A nobleman might have dozens of servants, and they moved through his life constantly, anticipating needs, responding to commands, managing the household, and in the process, witnessing everything. The relationship between the wealthy and their servants was intimate in ways that are hard for us to imagine now. When we think of privacy as a right that everyone has equally, or should have, servants dressed their masters and mistresses, saw them naked, handled their bodies, knew their habits and preferences and secrets. They were in the bedchamber when the master woke. They were there when he went to sleep. They were present for illness, for intimacy, for every aspect of private life. They were expected to be invisible, to not comment on what they saw, to maintain the fiction that the master had privacy even when clearly he did not. But they were there, always there, and they knew. This created a strange paradox. The wealthy had more physical privacy than the poor, more ability to separate themselves from the general population, to create barriers and boundaries, but they were also constantly attended, constantly observed by those whose job it was to serve them. They traded one kind of visibility for another, the visibility to neighbors and community for the visibility to servants. And while the latter might have seemed less intrusive, less personal, it was still a form of being watched, being known, being unable to be truly alone. The desire to be alone, to be free from all observation, even by servants, seems to have grown over time among certain individuals. We have records of wealthy people building retreats, small structures in gardens or on estates, places where they could go without attendance, where they could think, read, pray, be solitary. These retreats, sometimes called closets or cabinets or, later, studies, represented a growing valuation of solitude, a sense that being alone was not just necessary occasionally for practical reasons, but was itself valuable, restorative, important for the health of the mind and spirit. This idea, that solitude was valuable, that privacy was not just a practical arrangement, but a psychological need, would become more widespread over the coming centuries. But its roots were here, in these small acts of separation, these attempts by certain wealthy individuals to carve out spaces where they could be alone, where no one else was present, where they could exist without witness. But again, these were exceptions, outliers, not the norm even for the wealthy, and certainly not for anyone else. For most people, the idea that you might want to be alone, that solitude was something to seek rather than something to fear or endure, was still foreign, strange, not part of the cultural understanding of how humans should live. And beyond the domestic space, beyond the home, the lack of privacy extended into other areas of life as well, into work, into justice, into the public activities that structured community and society. Consider work, the labor that occupied most of people's waking hours for most of history. For agricultural laborers, work happened largely outdoors, in fields, often in groups. Planting, weeding, harvesting, these were communal activities done by families or by groups of workers employed by a landowner, and the work was visible, observable by others. You could not slack off without being noticed, could not hide mistakes or poor workmanship, because others were there, working alongside you, seeing what you did. This visibility was a form of social control, a way of ensuring that everyone contributed, that the work got done, that standards were maintained. But it also meant that there was little privacy in the workplace, little ability to be alone with your thoughts, to work at your own pace, to have any separation between yourself and the group. You worked together, you ate together during breaks, you traveled to and from the fields together, and your work life was as communal as your home life. For craftspeople, for those who worked in trades, the situation was somewhat different but still largely public. A blacksmith worked in a forge that was open to the street, visible to passers-by, where customers could come and watch the work being done, where apprentices learned by observing and imitating the master. A weaver worked at a loom that might be in the main room of the house, visible to the family, or in a workshop that was open to inspection. A baker worked in a bakery that was part of the community, where people could see the bread being made, where the smell of baking drew people in, where the work was public, visible, known. There were few, if any, back rooms, few hidden spaces where work was done away from observation. The transparency of the work process was itself a kind of guarantee of quality, a way for customers to ensure they were getting what they paid for. But it also meant that the craftsperson had little privacy, little ability to control who saw their work, who knew their techniques, who watched them labor. Even in the realm of intellectual work, of writing and thinking and studying, privacy was limited. Scholars in medieval universities lived in communal settings, shared rooms with other students, studied in common halls, had little time or space for solitary contemplation. Monks, who devoted their lives to prayer and study, lived in monasteries that were communal by design, where the day was structured around group prayer, communal meals, shared work, and where even the cells where monks slept were often small, bare, and not truly private, with doors that could be opened for inspection, with rules that limited solitude, that required participation in communal life. The idea of the solitary scholar, working alone in a private study, surrounded by books, would emerge later as literacy spread, as books became more available, as some individuals gained enough wealth and autonomy to create such spaces. But for most of history, for most people engaged in intellectual or spiritual pursuits, the work happened in community, in the presence of others, under observation and with shared resources. And when it came to justice, to the enforcement of laws and punishment of crimes, privacy was perhaps least of all. Justice was public, spectacularly so. Trials happened in open courts, in town squares, in places where the community could gather and witness. Accused persons were brought before judges or juries in full view of anyone who wanted to watch. Testimony was given aloud for all to hear. Verdicts were announced publicly, and punishments, especially for serious crimes, were carried out in public in ways designed to maximize visibility, to turn the punishment into a public spectacle that served as both entertainment and warning. Executions happened in public squares, on scaffolds built for visibility, with crowds gathered to watch. The condemned person's final moments were entirely public, their fear and suffering on display, their death witnessed by hundreds or thousands. This was intentional, part of the point of execution as a form of justice, that it should be seen, that the community should witness the consequences of crime, that the spectacle should reinforce social norms and deter future violations. Lesser punishments were similarly public. A person might be placed in stocks or pillory, restrained in a public place where they could be seen and mocked, where passers-by could throw things at them, where their humiliation was complete and visible. Whippings happened in public, the lash falling on bare flesh while crowds watched. Brandings marked criminals' bodies with symbols that would identify them forever, and these markings were applied in public ceremonies. The smell of burning flesh, the cries of pain, all part of the public nature of justice. This public visibility of punishment was thought to be necessary, to be effective in maintaining order, and the suffering of the punished person, which we would now consider a private matter, something to be shielded from public view out of respect for human dignity, was instead made as public as possible, turned into a lesson, a warning, a form of communal participation in the enforcement of norms. Even lesser infractions, behaviors that violated social norms without rising to the level of crime, were often dealt with through public shaming, through mechanisms that made the offender's transgression visible to the whole community. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to stand in church wearing a mark or sign identifying her sin. A man accused of dishonesty might be paraded through the village with a sign around his neck. The community's judgment was expressed through visibility, through the removal of any privacy, through forcing the offender to be seen in their shame. This public nature of justice, this insistence on visibility and communal witness, reflected a broader cultural pattern, a sense that important matters should not be hidden, that the community had a right and a duty to know, to see, to participate in the enforcement of order and morality. And so we arrive, slowly, across centuries and continents, through countless small changes and quiet accommodations, at the world we know now. The world where you can close a door and be alone, where you can lock a bathroom and know no one will enter, where you can sleep in a room by yourself if you wish, where the most intimate moments of your existence happen in privacy, so complete that it feels like a basic fact of nature, something that has always been and always will be. But it has not always been. For thousands of years, humans lived differently, pressed together in single rooms, sleeping side by side with family and sometimes strangers, bathing in rivers with neighbors watching, relieving themselves in communal spaces, giving birth and dying in the presence of the whole household. They managed, they adapted, they created lives of meaning and connection in circumstances that would seem impossible to us now. And then, gradually, things changed. Walls thickened, rooms multiplied, doors appeared, locks turned, and privacy became not just possible but expected, then demanded, then understood as a fundamental human right. We gained something precious in this transformation, the ability to be alone, to have thoughts no one else knows, to control our own space and time. But perhaps we lost something too, some knowledge of how to live closely with others, some comfort in the constant presence of community, some acceptance of the full humanity of those around us that comes only from witnessing each other completely, without barriers, without doors to close. Tonight, as you lie in your own room, in your own bed, behind your own closed door, in privacy so absolute your ancestors could not have imagined it, perhaps you can feel the weight of all those centuries, all those people who slept differently, lived differently, who made do without what we now cannot imagine living without. They were not so different from us, these people of the past. They loved and feared and hoped and dreamed just as we do. They simply did it all in full view of each other, in the warmth of shared fires and shared breath, in the complicated intimacy of communal life. The story of privacy is not a story of progress from darkness to light, from primitive to civilized. It is simply a story of change, of humans adapting to new possibilities, creating new expectations, building new worlds out of old materials. And the story continues, even now, as our technologies create new questions about privacy, new ways of being seen and known, new challenges to the boundaries we have spent centuries constructing. But that is a story for another time, for another quiet evening, for another long, slow journey through the details of how humans live. Thank you for spending this time here, for listening, for staying with this quiet exploration of how people lived without privacy for thousands of years. If you found this journey interesting, if it helped you rest, if it gave you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, consider subscribing to our channel. There are more stories like this, more long, calm explorations of history's forgotten details, more evenings of gentle learning and quiet curiosity waiting for you. But there is no pressure, no urgency. Subscribe if you wish, when you wish, or simply return when you need another story, another voice in the dark, another slow walk through the vast, strange, familiar territory of human history. Rest well, sleep deeply, and know that across all the centuries, across all the changes, humans have always found ways to live, to endure, to make meaning out of whatever circumstances surrounded them. You are part of that long continuity, that endless adaptation, that quiet persistence. Good night.